Hello, class. We're now going to move into the second part of our introduction, which is more or less a review of how, uh, throughout history, people have tried to treat people with mental illness or mental disorders with psychopathology. Of course, when we're talking about the modern field of psychology, we're mainly talking about the work of from 1879 onward, after Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychology laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. But outside of the formal field of psychology, and certainly the more specific fields of clinical psychology and marriage and family therapy and counseling and social work and whatnot, people have been trying to come up with solutions to mental health problems for many years. And one thing I do want to talk about today, we're going to get a little bit into religion because religion fared pretty prominently in these attempts to try to handle mental illness. And we're going to get into some social issues as well. I hope that after today's lecture, you'll have a little bit of some better insight into how people with mental illness have been marginalized and have been systematically oppressed for many, many years. And how that has been a bit of a roller coaster ride. Sometimes we tend to do better at that, and sometimes we tend to do worse at that. And I at least want to put some of those issues on the table for you so we can talk about them intelligently, and so that if you are so inclined, you can do something about it. You can be an advocate of change. We certainly, I don't want this course to be about advocacy. This is primarily about your education and bringing you up to date on all of the material that you'll need. But I do want to mention that if you're in this field and you want to take this field seriously, I think advocacy is a big part of that. And one of the things that we can do is help reduce the stigma of what it means to have mental illness and what's it like. And of course, that requires a great deal of empathy. It requires us to get outside of our own heads for a while and to think about the very, very tough road that many other people with mental illness have. So anyway, that's my hope for today. So what I want to do is I want to start off with a name, Hippocrates, that some of you may have heard of before. If you've taken history and systems of psychology with me, you've undoubtedly heard this guy's name before. Hippocrates was, it's kind of considered to be the father of modern medicine. He was from Greece. He was one of the first people to perform dissections on human bodies. And his work was probably the first systematic undertaking of trying to understand how people could have certain personality traits or temperaments based on a physiological or medical variable. And so, in his case, when he would perform these dissections of deceased patients, of course, lacking microscopic technology, he didn't have the ability to look at the hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of chemicals in the human body. He was only able to observe that which was available to the naked eye. So these humors were blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. These are all visible to the naked eye. And Hippocrates put together that if a certain person had more of a certain kind of chemical or fluid in their body, that they tended to have personality traits that corresponded with those fluids. And so the names he gave to these personality types based on the fluid that was available the names were sanguine, choleric, melancholy, and phlegmatic. Respectively, a sanguine person is an optimistic, cheerful person. Often they have a ruddy complexion, rosy cheeks. They're outgoing, they're sociable, they get along with people, they're positive, frequently happy. Uh, a choleric personality is someone who tends to be, if sanguine is a preponderance of blood, the choleric personality is a preponderance of yellow bile. These people tend to be angry, manic, irritable, anxious. They often suffer from bipolar tendencies. Their moods were up and down, but they were frequently very disagreeable. Melancholy corresponded with black bile, and this was an indication that someone was down and depressed, and frequently very negative. And so the people that tended to have the worst pairing was melancholy choleric. Hippocrates also found that melancholy and choleric tended to go together, and that people who were often sanguine were also very phlegmatic. And see if this makes sense to you. Phlegmatic means a little bit slow, a little bit lazy, a little bit passive, um, tending to procrastinate, tending to sleep a lot. And so, what he often found is that if you're a typical sanguine phlegmatic, that means that you're a happy person, you get along with everybody, you're pretty laid back, but you might not get a lot done. Your grades might suffer a little bit because you're too sociable. Um, Whereas the melancholy choleric person is a person who tends to not have very many friends. They tend to be pretty responsible in their work, but they also tend to have a pretty negative lifestyle. So this goes way back, certainly before the time of Christ, by several centuries. So we're talking about a pretty ancient view here. The Roman physician Galen, a few centuries later, picked up on the work of Hippocrates and expanded it a little bit, but Hippocrates is really the name you need to remember. You probably know the name Hippocrates, incidentally, from the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath is based on the work of Hippocrates and his being the father of modern medicine. And this is a pledge that every doctor takes, that they will cause no harm to their patients and that they will conduct themselves with the highest ethical standards. Um, Lots of Greeks were influenced by Hippocrates, and therefore lots of Western civilization was influenced by the view of Hippocrates that our bodies may have something to do with whether or not we have certain personality traits or certain feelings and emotions or certain moods or certain behaviors, that mind and body go together, that the body can influence the mind, and the body doesn't do everything the mind says, and the mind doesn't do everything the body says. I think people like Plato especially considered the mind and the body to be two very different things, but at least they interacted in some way. There was some degree of correspondence between the two. Here's a couple of marble busts of Hippocrates. One thing that if you read any text on the history of abnormal psychology, you're always going to come across this. And I think it might be a little bit overstated, but in some ways I think it's also understated. And that is this. A lot of textbooks say that mental health did not progress for many, many years. There's kind of this prevailing attitude among a lot of science writers that our understanding of psychopathology did not advance because so many people attributed mental illness to supernatural forces such as demonic possession or curses or things like that. And so when you come across this kind of stuff in textbooks, there's a tendency to believe that people many years ago were not very enlightened, that they were superstitious, that they had very anti-scientific views, and did not make very good attributions. Their explanations for why people acted the way they did were pretty unsophisticated, and history books tend to be pretty unkind to people and their anti-scientific attitudes. First off, I think that is, earlier when I said that I think that's both an overstatement and an understatement. What I mean is, I think it's an overstatement because people, lots of scientists, underestimate the significant contribution that religious studies have made to knowledge in general. For example, most of the major universities in Europe and in the United States, even a lot of the major Research One institutions, were founded by religious people who believed that one of the great acts of worship that we could offer to God was to acquire as much knowledge as possible and to educate as many people as possible. In fact, many missionaries around the world, missionaries have this kind of negative reputation as being colonizers and imperialists, but when you think about how much missionaries accomplished in their efforts to educate people, I mean, what's the first thing that a missionary would do? Even missionaries that were heavily criticized, one of the first things they would do is set up a hospital and set up a school. So the church has always had this bad reputation as being anti-scientific and anti-knowledge. But if you actually more closely inspect the record, there's so much good work that's been done. And so that's where I think it's been overstated a little bit. Where I think this is understated is there are still a whole bunch of religious people around the world, including Christians, who believe that mental illness is basically all inside of a person's head, and that it's something that they just that it's the result of sin, it's the result of disobedience, and this has been something that's been around religion for a long time. What's very interesting about this is that Jesus himself made zero connection at all to a person's sinfulness and whether or not bad things would happen to them. In fact, that happened on a couple of occasions where his disciples would say, "Hey, look at this person who's blind, or look at this person who's disabled. What kind of sin must have been in this person's life for them to have been so afflicted or so cursed?" And Jesus was very clear in saying neither he sinned nor his mother or his father sinned. This is something that it's one of those bad things that happens in life, but at the end of the day, God will be glorified. And that one of the reasons why God lets bad things happen is because he wants eventually for people to be redeemed, that he wants them to be forgiven, and he at the end of the day, he wants to be glorified. And so it's one of those mysteries that he says that we have to endure in this life. That's a very difficult thing to have to deal with. But it's just very interesting how so many Christians can forget that core teaching of Christ's and assume that if something bad has happened to a person, that must have been because of some sort of sin. And as you might be able to guess, I really disagree with that approach. We do know that the Bible talks a lot about the presence of supernatural forces acting upon nature. That's exactly what we mean by supernatural, is when something that is not normally natural or typical happens in a very atypical way. It's when God more or less intervenes into the lives of people, that the lives that they normally would have lived without God, those are suddenly interrupted by an act of intervention on the part of God. Some people might even call this a miracle. But people for many years have believed in the presence of supernatural forces trying to act upon people. Now, it's not my place to evaluate whether or not this is true, but if we are telling the story of psychology and the story of mental illness here, we do need to at least make mention of the fact that many people, for many thousands of years, have attributed mental illness to demonic possession. The Roman Catholic Church has an extensive history of trying to fight this by having certain priests who are specially trained to exorcise demons that appear to be plaguing people and plaguing their mental health. We also know that in examining almost all cultures, there are lots of superstitious behaviors have been found. It's not to say that superstitions don't still exist. Of course, we know that they do. People will still visit psychics and astrologers and astrologists and people like this. So superstitions are definitely still there. If you don't believe me, just watch baseball players and all the different tics and nervous routines they go through before even taking a swing of the baseball bat. There's a lot of superstitious behaviors that still exist to this day. And a lot of what has happened in history of mental illness has been the result of what we call false attributions. False attributions is when you say that a certain person has a problem because of something, and that something that you say that it is that was responsible for it is clearly not the cause, but you come to believe that it's the cause. Like, for example, people used to believe that getting bitten by a tarantula would inject certain toxins into you, and it would cause you to behave in a really wild and uncontrollable way, when in fact that was just a placebo effect. Tarantulas can bite people, but they're not poisonous to people. So it was just it was the power of suggestion or the power of belief that caused people to act that way. So history is full of lots of false attributions, and in fact, there are a lot of people who call themselves healers who are able to heal people through the placebo effect. It's actually a very serious field of study, the placebo effect, and it's a very powerful thing that I hope we can talk about at other times during this course. As you read through your textbook, though, basically I'm saying all of this because I think you'll discover that the author of your text, Comer, he's pretty anti-church. I think he probably felt that the church was pretty anti-scientific and held the science of psychology back by decades, if not centuries, and I think he's being a little bit too harsh there. So moving on. By the way, it is interesting to note that many, many people who are becoming psychologists today are also very religious people. Psychology tends to have one of the lowest rates of religious people practicing in the field, and yet many, many people who are very faithful do go on to become therapists, and of course I'm one of them. Okay, moving along here, we do know that exorcism still exists. Interestingly, if you are Roman Catholic and you think that you are possessed by a demon, one of the first things the Roman Catholic Church will tell you to do is to actually go visit a doctor. They want you to rule out any kind of psychiatric illness or any other kind of medical illness that could be treated using conventional scientific or medical treatments. Then and only then, if the problem still persists, will they consider calling in a priest to perform an exorcism. It's a decision that remains very controversial. Many people feel like it could hurt people more than help them, but the church takes the view that demon possession is not all that common, but when it's there, it's bad, and so we should have people specially trained to help if something like that happens. One of the problems, of course, is how do you know that a person is possessed by a demon? This is one of the questions that, even if demons are still active and still real, it's very difficult to assess whether or not someone has actually been possessed. And so the big controversy that I have when it comes to demonology and the study of demons and whether demons are actually affecting a person's mental health is there's no scientific way to examine whether or not it's possibly true because you can't disprove it. It's a non-falsifiable notion. But just know that that is an attitude you will encounter among many people. When I was in graduate school, a woman once came up to me and she found out that I was studying schizophrenia. And she said, "But Jay, don't you really feel like schizophrenia is just demon possession?" And I was shocked at what she said because, of course, I don't believe that schizophrenia is the result of demon possession. Schizophrenia is a disease. It's traceable. It's pretty clear what's happening in a person's brain. It's very heterogeneous. It's very complex, but I don't think that it's some sort of divine punishment or some sort of thing like that. Do I believe it's possible that demons are capable of attacking a person? Yes, I guess it's possible. It's just using our methods of research and assessment, it's just impossible to tell whether a demon is really there or not. I guess the only way is to get exorcised, and if the demon is gone, then maybe the person, you can say retrospectively, had a demon. I don't know. One other tricky thing is that scientists are only able to measure that which physically manifests itself and causes some sort of an observable behavior. And is there ever a time in which demonic possession doesn't manifest itself physically? Like, so even the times in the Bible when Jesus cast out a demon, it always had some sort of physical action that accompanied it. The person who was possessed was behaving in a very specific way, and then when Jesus would cast out the demon, he would do something very physical, like touch the person or shout at the demon or something like that, and the demon would leave. And so that's another reason why it makes it very difficult, is that the only thing that we're capable of observing is something physical, and once we observe it to be physical, we're much less likely to say that it was demonic. But again, how else would a demon manifest itself except for physically? So you can see how very confusing all of this is. I don't know if I'm going to provide you with a lot of answers, but at least I want to raise the issue because it's something that you'll be very likely to see, especially if you work or relate closely to some pretty traditional religious traditions, like some pretty conservative churches, where there might be some degree of skepticism or animosity towards science. You might be more likely to encounter people who believe that mental illness is caused by demon possession. What happened then, especially in Western civilization, as many people became mentally ill, this began this kind of what I like to call the roller coaster ride of society responding really well to mentally ill people, and then society responding really terribly to mentally ill people. So as you track this, it's important to keep in mind what else was going on in centuries after the Greek and Roman empires. We're now getting into the Middle Ages, and you start getting into the Industrial Revolution in Europe in the 17 and 1800s. And with increased industry, you had many, many people moving to the city. And when you move people to the city, several things happen. Number one, the power of the church tends to go down because church power is usually most powerfully exercised in small towns where there's not a lot of government oversight and where the church is usually, especially back in that era, the priest would often be the most educated person in town. So they had a lot of authority. But once you move to cities during the Industrial Revolution, with increased urbanization, power shifts into the hands of publicly elected officials, and so City Hall becomes very important. So it's kind of interesting. Like today, if you go to Italy and you visit some of these old towns, the churches are the biggest buildings in town. But if you move into the city, then the city halls are the largest buildings in town, and that's pretty typical of the pattern throughout Europe. The bigger the city, the bigger the government buildings, and the smaller by comparison the churches are compared to those buildings. So power was wrested away from the church, and it became more in the hands of publicly elected officials. The second thing that tended to happen is that mental illness was not just now the case of living in a small town and having one or two people in town be kind of like the town fool, or the one person in town that everybody was weird but kind of benevolently put up with and understood. Now you have many, many people in a concentrated area with lots of stress, lots of anxiety, lots of violence, lots of other things. Now you have a very large mentally ill population and a very large homeless population. And as this happens, then the visibility, people begin to view this as being potentially a threat. The visibility of mental illness begins to go way up. So this would begin. What would happen is that these people would not get cared for and the conditions would be terrible. And then usually good people would intervene and try to make the situation better. Um, the conditions in a lot of these places when they would try to provide treatment centers for the mentally ill were usually pretty awful. But at the very least, this was the beginning of mental health institutions and hospitals. So the conditions were usually pretty terrible, but at least it was a start. Johann Weyer, a Dutch physician, was probably the first person, this is in the 1500s during the Renaissance, to treat psychopathology as a disease, and he believed that the mind was very susceptible to psychopathology the more diseased a person was. And then in other locations throughout Europe, people began to set up mental health specific facilities designed to treat people who were mentally ill. In Geel, Belgium, for example, there was a colony that housed mental patients, and they were treated very, very well, very humanely. And this first shrine, this mental health shrine, became a forerunner of modern facilities and community treatment. But as I said, remember there was that roller coaster ride of it goes up and it goes down. And so for every one or two places like Geel, Belgium, there would be probably 10 or 20 places that were just disastrous. And what I mean by disastrous is basically very poorly funded places where people who were mentally ill were sent and pretty much had a nightmarish existence inside these asylums. You know, the word asylum is a very nice word. It means a place of refuge, a place of tranquility, a place of peace. But when we say the word insane asylum, we usually think of something very nightmarish and horrible. And there's a lot of reason to believe that it was horrible. Here's a little print of Johann Weyer and witches who were burned at the stake. Weyer was among the very first to protest the persecution of witches, and he argued that what they were doing was harmless, and tried to get people to dismiss them, but he was severely punished for his beliefs. So asylums, again, the idea was a good idea. Mentally ill people did need a place to go, but over time the conditions got really, really bad. They got to be overcrowded, the funding would go away, and people realized that there just weren't enough resources. The first prominent example of an insane asylum was Bethlehem Hospital, which started in 1547. Again, mid to late Renaissance, and it was started by, of all people, Henry VIII. You remember Henry VIII, right? The guy that very much wanted a male heir and went through several wives in an effort to try to get one of the wives to bear him a son. And he blamed the wives for his inability to have a male heir, even though it is the male, not the female, who determines the gender of the baby. Anyway, he started this hospital called Bethlehem Hospital. It's in London. And the original structure, or lots of the original structure, is still there. I'll show you the picture. Here's a print of the original Bethlehem Hospital. Incidentally, the name Bedlam, when we'll use that term Bedlam to describe a situation that's out of control, crazy, madness. Bedlam is just how people would pronounce Bethlehem Hospital, not Bethlehem like in Israel where Jesus was born. Bethlehem Hospital. And people, instead of saying Bethlehem, would say Bedlam in that kind of South London accent, East and South London accent, and that was the pronunciation. The frame of that original hospital is still there in Lambeth, a neighborhood south of the River Thames in London, that currently houses the Imperial War Museum, a fantastic museum in its own right and definitely worth a visit. In fact, I took a group of psychology students to this museum just to see the original building and to see a fantastic museum in its own right. Um, so the reputation spread that this asylum was not a very good place. It was a place that even for a while rich people would come and visit it like they were visiting a zoo. It was very dehumanizing and very cruel. People were largely kept pretty malnourished. They were bound by chains. There were all sorts of interventions and so-called treatments that were designed to calm people down, but they were pretty inhumane and pretty cruel. And so what began to happen is people began to get more outraged by what they saw, and thus began the moral treatment or reform movement for mental illness. And this was largely started by a physician named Philippe Pinel, who is the head of La Bicêtre Hospital in Paris. That hospital also is still there. He believed that people should be treated with respect, just like any other ill person. So mentally ill people should be treated the same as everyone else. They should not be bound by chains. They should not be beaten when they acted out. Another example of this moral treatment reform movement was William Tukey, the York Retreat up in Yorkshire, England. This is one of those places that had big, expansive lawns and gardens, and very nice. When you think of, like, if you ever watch a movie where someone's been sent to a insane asylum, it's either presented as a nightmarish place, or if it's one of these upscale places, there are lots of gardens and ponds and walking paths and these kinds of places where people basically walk around to try to keep calm. The York Retreat was one of those kinds of places. And what's interesting is that the patients responded. Now, they didn't respond. Some of them got better, and some of them were cured, but not all of them were cured. And this explains why this roller coaster of recognition of the mentally ill goes up and it goes down. So the typical pattern is people notice that there's a problem, so then they throw all sorts of money at it. But then as soon as you throw the money at it, this causes people to build these facilities, and that takes the mentally ill people off the street or wherever they are, and then people lose track of them, and so they become this mysterious other group of people. And once you get rid of them from the public consciousness, then the desire to fund them and give them money and give them resources goes away. Also, when people don't all the way get better, they think that it's money poorly spent. So in other words, we should be treating people with mental illness well because they're people, not because we are guaranteeing that they're going to get better. Of course, we want them to get better, but treating people humanely is just the right thing to do. Well, but not everybody believes that necessarily. They believe that unless the person is going to get cured, why should I spend my hard-earned money on that problem? So, like I say, the roller coaster ride of good treatment for the mentally ill goes up and it goes down. The moral treatment, though, spread even over to the United States. The name in the United States most associated with this is Benjamin Rush, Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, and he's considered the grandfather of American psychiatry. Dorothy Dix, the reformer who was responsible for sparking a huge moral treatment movement, was very effective on the public policy level by getting government officials to recognize the problem. And as a result of her efforts, 32 state hospitals dedicated to treating mental illness were created. Here's Benjamin Rush and Dorothy Dix. And here's one of those state hospitals. This is actually a Veterans Administration hospital operated at the federal level, not the state level, but this is for patients. I put this picture up because I had an uncle who served in the Korean War, who passed away several years ago, but spent most of his life in this hospital after suffering from a war injury to the head and severe PTSD from which he never recovered. But he enjoyed a very good life in this hospital, and people cared for him a great deal in this place. Not all state hospitals or VA hospitals are great, but this one happened to be a really good one. And then the roller coaster goes back down again. So, like we said, there are lots of reasons why mental health treatment starts to lose its funding. Well, sometimes they grow too quickly. Sometimes there are systemic problems that are exposed. In fact, there was a recent controversy with the Veterans Administration just a few years ago where there was some misappropriation of funds, and it caused a lot of people to want to defund it. So again, it goes up and it goes down. Also, we can sometimes have unrealistic expectations that the mentally ill are going to uh, make too much of a recovery, and when we should be focused more on just providing tender, loving care to people. Um, but some people get pretty disillusioned when they see that people aren't getting better when they want them to. They can become overcrowded. They can become expensive to operate. There's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of it. They tend to be very administrative heavy, which is very expensive, and so that's another one of the reasons for the decline. There's another reason too that I want to point out for you. There's this acronym you may have heard of called NIMBY, NIMBY. I don't know if any of you have heard of this before, but NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard, NIMBY. The idea here is that there are lots of people who think that you should build facilities to treat addicts, that you should build facilities to treat people with mental illness. You should build all sorts of facilities. This is a great idea, but as soon as the prospect of one of these buildings or programs gets to the city council level, citizens almost always shoot it down. They think it's a great idea, but they just don't want it to be built in their backyard. Sure, build a substance abuse treatment facility. That would be fantastic. Just don't build it anywhere near my house. It's going to cause property values to go down. Sure, build a halfway house or a sober living center near or in our town, but just don't build it near my house. I don't want strange people going in and out of there at all hours of the night. That's called NIMBY. So when NIMBY is successful, when people are successful at getting these hospitals or facilities built on the fringes of town, the more removed from society the patients would become. And when this would happen, the less normal these people were perceived to be. So prejudice tends to grow as contact with the mentally ill decreases. I want to say that again. Prejudice tends to grow as contact with the mentally ill tends to decrease. So when that happens, we tend to not feel as sorry for them. We tend to not want to help them as much, and then our funding goes down. The taxpayers don't want to pay for these kinds of programs, and so they vote them down. And so long-term hospitalization for many years became the norm when these kinds of places were defunded. One book that was written, Clifford Beers wrote a book about his bout with schizophrenia called A Mind That Found Itself. This was written back in 1908. This book was like the Uncle Tom's Cabin for mental illness. It shed lots of light on the problems that mentally ill people face, and it shocked many people. And so this actually helped to repair things, but at the time that he wrote the book, things were in really bad shape. That's Clifford Beers in his book, A Mind That Found Itself. So it details his own bout with schizophrenia and his coming out of it. Early on, especially in the United States, there were different views on what mental illness really was. Some people believed that it was entirely due to physical causes. This was called the somatogenic perspective. A German physician and psychiatrist named Emil Kraepelin was among the very first to discover syndromes, which are clusters of symptoms of a psychological nature, and he was one of the very first to organize them and to put them into kind of a classification system so that we could diagnose people according to what kind of syndromes they were suffering from. Krafft-Ebing's 1897 that syphilis, which is a venereal disease transmitted via contact or congenitally, leads to a mental illness condition called general paresis. General paresis is characterized by having irreversible mental delusions and some physical problems such as paralysis. So it came from syphilis. Well, this discovery got a whole bunch of people excited because they said, see, mental illness really is caused by a physical problem. But one of the problems with this, though, is that this was really the only discovery that was made, and no other discoveries like it were made for a long time. So even though people thought at the time that this was a great discovery, it was just a single discovery. For the most part, this idea that mental illness could be caused by something physical never really took off. And in fact, psychiatry was really stagnating for a long period of time until the 1950s. It was in the 1950s when certain medications were found to treat a lot of mental illness symptoms. That's when psychiatry, especially in the United States, really took off. If it weren't for these medications, psychiatry today would probably be a very minor profession. But it's turned into a large profession because of the success of medications. Here is Emil Kraepelin. Those are his dates, 1856 through 1926. Another early perspective was psychogenic. This, of course, was made popular by Sigmund Freud and the people who trained Sigmund Freud, like the Parisian neurologist, the French neurologist Jean Charcot, and Joseph Breuer, who trained, both of these people trained Sigmund Freud. They were definitely on the side of mental illness is caused by psychological problems. One of the early proponents of this view was Friedrich Anton Mesmer. We don't talk about him too much, though, because even though he did a lot of hypnosis, he was a scandalous human being who falsified his dissertation and he was more of a charlatan, so we don't pay too much attention to him. But anyway, he was there too. Here's Jean Charcot and Joseph Breuer. When several treatments failed, when we tried to treat people with mental illness, even when we tried with good intentions and good spirits, when we failed, sometimes people would get very frustrated that they would not get better. And even the people that were trying to treat them would get frustrated. And this resulted in a lot of cruelty. Some people felt like it was ethical. Believe it or not, at one time in our country, we believed it was ethical to sterilize people who were mentally ill and prevent them from having children, because people who have mental illness, when they have children, their kids have a higher chance of having that same mental illness. So sterilization programs have been around in this country. In fact, they were only eliminated in recent decades. It was a long-lasting phenomenon. The United States Supreme Court declared that sterilizing people was constitutional in 1927. We also know that during Nazi Germany, National Socialism in Germany, the Nazis killed at least 70,000 people who were diagnosed with mental illness and sterilized 375,000 people who were thought to be mentally ill, mentally weak, suffering from afflictions, passive, homosexual, whatever. They tried to eradicate it in very cruel ways. The United States sterilized 45,000 people from 1907 to 1945. So this is a well-documented history of our attempts to try to get rid of mental illness altogether when our attempts to treat it did not seem to work. So moving to today, current trends would include the following. Number one, we've seen a massive increase in outpatient psychotherapy. So it used to be if you had a mental problem or you were anxious or depressed, you would check into a hospital for a while and they would keep you there until you got better. Nowadays, you're much more likely just to go and visit a therapist and maybe get some medication from a psychiatrist. And it's pretty common. 12% of the population in any given year is in psychotherapy. As many as 1 in 6 adults go see a therapist regularly. We also have an increase in specialized programs that target specific problems, such as anger management classes for people who have anger problems, Alcoholics Anonymous for people who struggle with alcohol addiction, and so on and so forth. We also have been investing a whole heck of a lot in preventive care. The idea here is that we shouldn't wait for a person to develop depression. We should probably try to intervene when we first see some warning signs that a person could be becoming depressed. We also have seen, very controversially, the increased role of managed care or health maintenance organizations in the lives of people. So if you are insured in the state of California, if you don't have a lot of money, you might have Medi-Cal. If you have some degree of money, you probably have an HMO. So Kaiser would be an example of an HMO. And then some people have some sort of private insurance arrangement through their work where they get pretty good benefits. And then some people who have quite a bit of money opt for what's called a concierge service, which allows you to go visit a doctor an unlimited number of times if you pay a flat rate, I think on a yearly basis. So the problem with HMOs is that they will cover your treatment provided they get to review your case and offer suggestions as to what kind of care you should be getting. So unfortunately, that means that even if you have a psychologist or a therapist that you really like to see, you may only get reimbursed for a certain number of sessions if they don't feel like the psychologist is doing a good enough job at getting rid of your depression or anxiety or things like that. So a lot of people have come to really resent HMOs because they feel like all they're trying to do is make money. And to a certain degree, they are. They are publicly traded companies, they have shareholders, and they are in the business of trying to make money. This has been a heavily, heavily criticized issue. The Affordable Care Act under President Barack Obama has many aspects of it have tried to get rid of this kind of yucky relationship that people have with their insurance companies when they have to go time and time and time again to their insurance companies, or when doctors have to go to the insurance companies and literally beg to get reimbursed for their services. And people would just rather have that be done far fewer times. And so that's the Affordable Care Act essentially tried to do. Other current trends is that people don't tend to go to therapists all that much. Think about someone like Sigmund Freud, who typically saw patients once per day. Nowadays, people don't even go once per week anymore. They might go once a month or once every couple of months. The majority of clients that I see, I will see in the first several months. I'll see them every week. And then as we've gotten most of their issues under control and handled, I usually go to start seeing them about once every month or two. In fact, over half of my client population that I see right now are people who come in about once a month. We also see an increase in the number of therapeutic interventions for milder problems. So it isn't just like schizophrenia or bipolar. People will come in if they're having trouble communicating with their spouse or things like this. It doesn't always have to be some huge, huge issue. Other issues, positive psychology, which is trying to promote feelings of happiness and well-being among people. Multicultural psychology, of course, given that in our country there are higher birth rates among racial minorities, and there are, in recent years, there have been very large demographic shifts. The need to have a broader understanding of conducting therapy from a multicultural perspective is absolutely essential. It's almost impossible to be a therapist nowadays and not have to have some sort of training in diversity issues and multiculturalism. We also know that a big current trend happened in 2008, and more formally with Obamacare in 2014. Mental health was listed as a parity diagnosis. What this means is that if you go and see a psychologist for depression, you can bill your session just as if you were seeing a medical doctor for diabetes, right? It's considered, that's what's called a parity diagnosis, when you can bill for treatment. Other current trends, especially now, cyber therapy and telehealth or telepsychology, conducting therapy over the phone, especially now with coronavirus, COVID-19. A lot of people are seeing their therapists online. This is just as a lot of people are seeing their medical doctors online. Now, even smartphone apps that are dedicated to trying to provide tips for mental illness care and treatment are flourishing these days. And last slide here, just some other issues to consider here. 43% of Americans still believe that mental illness is the sufferer's fault. So there still is some degree of stigma. 31% of people believe that mental illness is the result of personal weakness. 35% believe mental illness is a result of sin. So we have some attitudes that need some adjusting here, right? We know that people can't help this stuff. This is not something that people ask for. So we need to work on changing hearts and changing minds to provide adequate care. There are 100,000 severely mentally ill homeless people in the United States. Those of you who have a heart for the homeless and want to help out there should definitely have some degree of training in mental illness, because most homeless people are struggling with mental health issues. 135,000 incarcerated people in our country are suffering from serious mental illness. And 35% of Americans are racial minorities, which means this gets back to this idea as to why it's so important for our therapists and the people who are treating people that they get adequate training, because our country is changing. The demographics are changing, and the values are changing, and a lot of the belief systems are changing, and so it's important that we keep up with the changing times. It's critically important that we all get training in this area.